I've met so many great women in my life who I really wanted to be with, but I never said anything, and later finding out that they were actually quite interested in me. They never knew. I was afraid of being hurt, afraid of being rejected and what that would mean about me. It was just like I didn't want to commit to anything. I didn't want to say, I wanted a relationship. If a woman said to me, where is this going? What are you looking for from dating? When those questions would come up, I would panic. It felt like if they're upset that I'm wrong and I'm bad and I've done something wrong and I've done something bad. So what changed? How did I go from this person who was afraid of commitment to having a baby? Welcome to the Authentic Man podcast. I am your host, David Chambers. This is a podcast for men who want more and less from life. More deep connection, more emotional intelligence, more self-awareness, and more great sex. And less heartache, less conflict, less overthinking, and less stress. Creating dating lives, sex lives, and relationships that are incredible and authentic. My deepest goal is that you, the listener, can take away what you hear in this podcast and apply it to your life, so that you can experience greater happiness, transformational growth, deeper relationships, and profound sexual intimacy. I believe that as men, we are capable of so much more depth than we are shown or led to believe. So join me as we get deep into this. Welcome back to another episode of the Authentic Man podcast. I'm your host, David Chambers. And if you're a long-time listener, it's been a little while since I've recorded an episode, a solo one. And I'm going to do a few of these actually over the next few weeks, just the topics I really want to dive into a bit deeper. As you may or may not know, I've had a baby. This is the first podcast I've recorded since, because, having a screaming baby in the house can be quite difficult to record. Good sound quality and so forth. So this is the first episode that I am recording. And today I'm going to talk about something that's come up again and again in the clients I've worked with around kind of commitment phobia, around avoidance, which I've often spoken about in the past, where the men I'm working with, they are so afraid of commitment that these fears come up at certain junctures of the relationship, right? So I'm going to talk about my journey, right? Because I think it's going to be really useful because, I've gone from, a number of years ago being really scared of commitment. I felt like I couldn't commit. I'd never be in a committed relationship. I'd never be in a monogamous relationship. And now I've just had a baby, and little Bjorn, he's inside the front room that's behind me with Orsa, and he's trying to go to sleep. And if you didn't know, babies, they like sleeping, but they are very funny about getting to sleep. They get very grumpy about it and they cry a lot. I had a lot of fear about having kids. So let me take you through a bit of a walkthrough, right? How were my relationships before? Like in the past, maybe go back 10 years ago or so. There's infidelity, cheating, lying, hiding, being afraid to kind of speak up and say what was true for me. I had this thing where I was in a relationship and I'd be afraid to say like what I was doing for fear that my partner might get upset, and then I'd have to deal with her upset, and I didn't want to deal with her upset. So I would hide what I was doing, not because necessarily I was doing it for malicious, but sometimes I was. But I just didn't want to deal with any potential grief. I was like, how can I always keep the peace, right? Another thing I used to do when I was single was I would date and sleep with multiple women, 3 or 4 at the time, sometimes more, but usually 3 or 4 at a time. That was my thing. I used to call it the 4-piece, if you ask Ahmad, my former co-host and good friend. It was something I did a lot because, I could sleep with multiple women, and it also meant that I wouldn't catch feelings and they wouldn't catch feelings. That made life much easier. If no one's catching feelings, no one's going to get hurt. And that was the thing I wanted. I was like, I don't want anyone to get hurt. Right. But I was simultaneously also doing something that a lot of avoidant men I speak to, right? And what that is avoiding going after the women that they really want to be with for fear that rejection would happen, right? This is something I started to see years afterwards, or I should notice in myself. Like I would not really go after the women I really wanted to because I was afraid of rejection, or I was afraid that I wouldn't be good enough for them. I would tell myself I wasn't good enough for them, right? And that led to all sorts of things that, end up in relationships I didn't really want to be in. Allowing people to move through my life who I really wanted to be with, but I never said anything, and later finding out that they were actually quite interested in me. But because I was playing it so cool, which is another trait of the avoidant man, they never knew. They never knew, right? Because I was afraid of being hurt. I was afraid of being rejected and what that would mean about me, right? Another thing was I was meeting a lot of great women, right? I say this to my clients often. I've met so many great women in my life, right? Kind, generous, loving, supportive, all those things for the most part, right? And I've either not been into them, or I've been with them and I fucked up that relation some way. I've sabotaged the relationship through my own mental stories, which we're going to talk a bit more about later on. But I had this experience of meeting lots of great women, and I speak to a lot of my clients and they're like, oh, I meet lots of great women, and then it's me that messes things up, or me that gets scared, or me that gets afraid, or me that backs away. And this is all the same for myself. Another thing that was really of a struggle for me, and I see the same with avoidant men, is struggling to express love, right? Struggling to express love and affection in a way that our partner can receive, right? Because my thing is that, oh, I don't need to, I've told you I love you yesterday. Why do I need to say again? Or I don't like touch. I don't want to, hold hands in public. When there was also a little bit underneath there that was like, oh, I don't want to be seen with this person, because if I'm seen with this person, then I'm closing my options down, and then everyone knows I'm with this person. And then if I leave this person, I have to, the world's going to know that it's ended and I'm a failure. That's also a little bit of an undercurrent that was there as well for me. Another thing I was really focused on was I was a lot, having as much sex as possible, especially when I was single. It was just like, have as much sex as possible with as many people as possible. Why not? I should do. That's what you do as a man. And there's some of that kind of toxic masculinity. There was definitely an undercurrent for me for a lot of years of like, just having sex for the sake of having sex. And it's relatively easy, if I'm honest, for the most part. And it could be done pretty honestly as well, without, lying and manipulating people. It's one thing I often tell my clients. If you want to just have sex, cool. Don't lie and manipulate anyone. You don't need to. Be honest about it. I was also really scared of kind of deeper intimacy, right? And falling in love. I hated this idea of falling in love. Having multiple women is definitely a way of avoiding falling in love with anyone. And, this created a lot of heartache for me, a lot of longing for people that I liked, and then, avoiding really getting into it or getting to know them too well, or avoid, going after them, as I said before. And the kind of avoidance and fear of emotional intimacy was this emotional closeness that I didn't want, or I didn't want to share too much of what I was feeling. I was afraid of being judged by my partner and so forth, right? And again, I see this in clients, and I'm going to tell you about a workshop and a program that I've got coming up to really dive into these topics a bit more as well. All the details in the show notes for those. So if you want to go there early, you can find them there. I often used to feel this panic, and this is a real kind of common commitment fear. I used to feel this panic if a woman said to me on a date or when we were dating, questions like, where is this going? What are you looking for from dating? What sort of, are you looking for a relationship? When those questions would come up, I would panic. There'd be this internal panic, not external, because I look so super fucking cool externally. There'd be an internal panic, right, that would happen. And it would be me, the panic of how can I, what do I say here? How can I say the right thing? How can I say a thing that doesn't upset her? How can I keep my options open? How can I avoid committing to anything that I later can't do? That was a big thing. If I say I'm going to do something, I felt like I had to do it in the future. I couldn't change my mind. I know this is a common thing for the men that I work with as well. It was just like I didn't want to commit to anything. I didn't want to say, oh, I wanted a relationship, and then 3 months later not want a relationship with her, and then have to tell her I didn't want the relationship with her, and then have to deal with the emotions and feelings that would come from that. Because I've had some situations which are very normal in dating where, things didn't work out. I wasn't as into someone as maybe they were into me, or things weren't progressing where I thought they were, and then being upset by it, which is a very reasonable response. But I was afraid of dealing with the upset, because it felt like if they're upset that I'm wrong and I'm bad and I've done something wrong and I've done something bad. And that's a really important piece that used to come up a lot for me, is this feeling bad, feeling guilty, feeling wrong in some way, for just wanting what I wanted, or for, being open and honest about that sometimes as well. So that fear of commitment, of like not wanting to commit to anything, or wanting to just go with the flow, or say this is how, just to see how things go. Quite often was something that I would do, or avoid any questions around commitment, or joke about it when it came up, or all sorts of deflection tactics I had during those times. Something else that was kind of, my scene many years ago was I'd be in a relationship. I'd never feel like I was a good enough boyfriend. And this was kind of twofold. It was partly because, if my partner had a complaint or an upset, I took it as that I am a bad boyfriend. Not that I've done something that they don't like or they're upset, that I am a bad person. I took it as like a character problem with me that was permanent, right? This very fixed mindset of like things can be very binary. Like I'm a good boyfriend, I'm a bad boyfriend. Or that if there's a problem, it means if there's a problem in a relationship, this is how I often be. If there's a problem in the relationship, she's upset about something, like, I don't know, I'm hanging out with my friends a lot and she's like, we don't spend time together. I took it as that, oh, I'm a bad person, I'm wrong. And it would kind of generate shame for me. Instead of looking at it from like, oh, there's this thing I do that she doesn't like, maybe we can negotiate a way that we can both be happy. I could never see that. It was either my way or their way. There was no middle negotiation. And that used to cause all manner of problems. And then it used to cause me then to hide certain things so that the upset wouldn't be created and so forth. And then there was a point where even when I met Orsa, I was only interested in open relating. And in many ways, this was really, really great for my own growth, from my avoidance. But it's also just another part of my avoidance. Because if I am in an open relationship, then I don't have to worry about cheating. I can kind of still sleep with who I want to up and to a degree. And I'm still not kind of entering into this next level of commitment. There's nothing wrong with open relating. I've got good friends who open relate, and I could definitely, I could see a future where me and also may dive back into that world again at some point. But for me, when I really look at it, and I really looked at it for a long time, it was just another way for me to have a safety net of not committing another part of me, or so I didn't have to do the work, or I could stay safe in some way. I keep my options open. Me and also were open for about a year of our relationship, and it was amazing for our communication, because I had to regularly have difficult conversations with her, very difficult conversations, and to experience having difficult conversations and the relation not to end, or for her to be upset and it not to be I'm wrong and bad, was really good for my own personal learning, my own personal kind of relational learning as well. So there are some things. Also, I used to be very judgmental, very black and white, like right and wrong, this and that, good and bad, like I'm right, you're wrong. I was very judgmental, very black and white in that way. And I see this very common in especially kind of logical avoidant men. This kind of comes up. I was also quite immature in many ways, this kind of immature masculine energy of I probably was a bit flashier there with good, like, I'd wear all the labels and the names and so forth. I was more interested in, like I said before, sex and lots of women instead of depth, and commitment, because, that's the world that I'd seen as what will make me happy, what would be a good relationship and so forth. And the last thing I'll add in is that I was really passive in relationships. I didn't lead relationships. I didn't make things happen. I was very passive / reactive to my partners. And when we're passive and reactive to our partners, we can really feel like our relationships, they don't go where we would want them to, or they don't become what we would want them to be, or we feel like relationships are always what our partner wants, right? Because when you're passive, you're not putting any energy into the direction of the relationship, or how you want it to the culture you want, or how you want things to develop. So it can very easily feel like relationships is like, oh, they're out of control, I can't do anything about it. But actually, it was my passivity that really made that happen. And this goes to some of the fears around expressing emotions and feelings and desires and so forth, and trying to avoid conflict. But ultimately I was a very passive relationship. So what changed? I've touched on some of it there, like some of the things that changed for me. I think one of the big things that changed for me, I think, was I learned to feel. I learned to feel more of my feelings and emotions, of my own feelings and emotions. What was going on for me, what I wanted, what I desired, what I was feeling when I was up, when I was feeling happy, when I was feeling sad. That was a big shift for me. And it's an ongoing shift. This feeling, this emotional intelligence piece is an ongoing piece, I think, for me. It will never stop. I will never get to this mastery, high mastery level of I'm done. I don't need to do any emotional work. So I don't think you get there. Not in this lifetime, not in the world that I think that we live in. I think that kind of never stops. So feeling more and expressing more of what I was feeling. And that's a range thing, right? It's a thing of like, oh, and also noticing the subtle feelings and sensations. There's some of this is, becoming more embodied, feeling the body and feeling the body's wisdom and feeling the sensations, because a lot of our feelings and emotions, they originate in sensations. We feel the sensations in response to what we think is external things, right? So the feeling more and communicating more, right, is something I definitely practiced when I was traveling through South America, and I was meeting, I broke up with my girlfriend at the time, and then I was traveling on, and I was meeting a lot of people, women, men, people who I was hanging out with, and I was just communicating more of my feelings. It was like a practice of like, people would be like, how are you feeling today? And I'd be like, oh, I'm feeling kind of sad. And in the past, I'd be like, oh, you can't say you're sad. You shouldn't say to people you don't know very well that you're feeling sad. And I would say, oh, I'm feeling sad, or I feel lonely. And I learned more and more to be okay with what I was feeling. Another thing I started to do more and more is to, instead of being judgmental of others and their experience, I became more curious and empathetic and compassionate. I would often consciously try and, when I listen to someone, be like, how is this similar to an experience that I've had or that I felt? And I would lean in that way and be curious and ask people, if they're talking about a situation or what's going on for them. And I did this in my dating life as well. So if I was dating someone and I remember going on a date with a girl, and it's a time when I was kind of only looking for an open relationship, and she said she wanted monogamy. And we were talking about monogamy and open relationships. And in the past, I would have been really dogmatic about that open relationships are the best and I'm right and you're wrong. And it could easily get into like a conflict or just me, feeling this kind of tension unnecessarily. Whereas I was more in a space of like, well, you're right and I'm right. And let's be curious and talk about the different aspects of those ways of relating. And I would, I remember talking to her all night about actually, and getting to the end of the evening, and we talked about sex and dating and relationships and our lives and our dreams. And it was a beautiful date, and we never actually saw each other again. But you see, I was more open and compassionate to experience. It wasn't about judgment. And I took the same ideas into my relationship, practicing being more compassionate, even when it's difficult. Compassion and empathy, I see it as kind of seeing things from someone else's point of view, is life-changing. Especially in relationship, because most of the arguments and disagreements we have in our relationships are about this idea that my way of seeing the world is correct and yours is wrong, right? And I look now and think, man, I spent hours of my life in conflict with girlfriends, and not really even in conflict because I would just avoid talking, right? They would say something, I would disagree, I wouldn't necessarily say anything, I'd get in a mood and I'd shut down and not talk, right? Instead of being like curious about them, because I saw is like their point of view versus my point of view, right? And those points of views can't coexist. Whereas when I really learn, I see it in my clients, I see it in the men on my programs, and to me more compassionate, empathetic, the more and more you realize there isn't just one singular worldview. There isn't one right or one wrong. Even if we're in a discussion or an argument or conflict with our partner, there isn't actually one correct thing. So much of the time, especially when we're talking about feelings and emotions. Sometimes it'll be different if we're looking at very concrete events. Like, did it rain today? Even that's subjective, right? I might say, oh, it didn't rain today. And I was in my office and she was at home. And I'd be like, no, it rained today. Didn't you see it? She'd be like, no, it didn't rain here. I was like, of course it rained here. I was in London too. Of course it rained. And we can be so petty in this way. We're trying to be right. Instead of going, oh, well, maybe it didn't rain where you are and it rained where I was. Oh, really? Great. Done. Two people with different points of view can coexist at the same time. And that can also be in, say, around a discussion about something that happened in a relationship. I'm trying to think of an example. Maybe this is something I'll talk a bit more about at a later date, but during Ulsa's labor, there was moments where what I was experiencing and what she was experiencing were vastly different, right? Obviously, she's experiencing labor. I'm just watching it. But we later talked about it afterwards. I was like, oh, when this happened, I was thinking that you were saying to me this thing, or you were showing me this thing, or you were trying to tell me something covertly under the words. And she was like, oh, actually, no, I wasn't. I was saying this thing. And so much of our conflict, so much of our difficulty in relationships is because we think our partner is saying something. We imagine they're saying a thing or they're acting a certain way, and it means something that it doesn't mean for them, right? And we are very sure in our own minds what our meaning is correct. And when we come up against their meaning, when they actually express what's going on, we often don't accept it. And that can be a huge thing. Or we get defensive about our point of view, or we start to attack their point of view, whatever it may be. And I just really slowly to stop doing this more and more, especially in the moments when I felt like I was being attacked. Those are the most important times to be compassionate and empathetic. When you feel like your partner's attacking you, the best thing you can do is climb out of your story, because there's some story you're running in your mind, some point of view, some personal narrative, and step into, why am I reacting this way? Right? Why am I reacting this way? What is she actually saying, and what am I saying? Right? And there's a wonderful tool I use inside my programs, and possibly in this workshop I mentioned earlier, to help men do that, help people do that, help couples do that. And it's really relationship changing. What else changed for me? My reactivity to the concept of commitment. And this is an interesting one, because I'm a very free-spirited person. I traveled the world for almost 2 years. I think it was like 22 months. And for most of it, I didn't really have a plan, especially for the back kind of 6 to 8 months. I didn't really have a plan of when I was going to finish or where I was going. I just kind of went with the flow. So I'm very easy to go with non-committalness. But often our idea of commitment is about the negativity of commitment, the pain of commitment, the restriction, the entrapment, the what it's going to take away from us. And I started to do a lot of journaling and a lot of work with coaches, actually, various coaches around commitment and what it meant. A spiritual mentor of mine who I spent, she does like a week-long retreat, and I've stayed with her a few times now, around commitment. And my story around commitment, why is that story I have around commitment, where it comes from, because of the things that I saw. Ultimately, when I grew up around people who became committed, they become unhappy. And even my dad telling me things about commitment, about how married people were boring and stuff like this. And I see how those stories that I heard outside of me, or what I viewed as a child or as a teenager, I internalized as the truth, right? If you get committed, if you commit to a relationship, you get hurt. Done. That's how it is. And I run this story in my mind that is the truth. Or you become restricted, or you're no longer free. So I started to really journal on this, and then I started to speak to people I knew who were committed as well. I got a friend of mine, he's been in a relationship for, I think now it must be like 13 years or so. And I remember speaking to him about commitment a few times. And he started to tell me, and he was a pretty wild guy before, well, still is, but definitely before he got married, he was definitely wild. And he talked about the benefits of commitment and how it helped him focus more, and how he had deepened the relationship and all these sorts of things. And it was all this started to come through like, wow, because I didn't see people being committed and see a benefit to it. I don't have a viewed experience. So I had to start to shift my own ideas about commitment. And I started to lean into commitment, like lean into committing to things. Sometimes a lot of these things were like outside of relationships, committing to something, going every single week, or, commit to meditation practice, to doing every day for a month, or doing breath work, going to a tantra class for every week. I pretty much went to a tantra class every week, pretty much for the best part of 3 or 4 years until COVID hit, 2-3 years until COVID hit. Just like these little commitments in our life that we make, we start to show ourselves that, oh, committing to something doesn't mean I lose. I continuously lose out and things are removed from my life, and you start to see what it adds. And, committing to the various other things, like I just started to see commitment a very different way. And it was a really important thing. And I run through this with a lot of my clients, actually, this kind of reframing commitment. And also then reframing the emotions that come up when we experience any sort of request for commitment, or someone who is giving us the feeling of commitment, not the feeling of commitment, but say you're dating somebody and they say to you on a date, like, oh, what are you looking for? Or they say to you before you go on a date, what are you looking for, from dating? We interpret that as someone almost trying to hit us with commitment in that moment, when actually they're just asking a very, very reasonable question, So is to start to notice the kind of somatic, the bodied experience of that, and be able to stay present. And this is where things like some of the things that are really important to me, things like meditation and breath work and embodiment work and emotional stuff, is to be able to be present in the moment, in a conversation, hearing the words, feeling the body, while also noticing the emotions that we have. Because often for most people, what happens is they just get hijacked. You're in a conversation with your partner, they tell you something, what you hear, they tell you that, you made the wrong turn down the road. This happened to me the other day, actually. I'll give you a prime example of where this could have gone very different in an earlier time in my life. Me and also were driving somewhere. I was driving to the hospital, actually, not when she was giving birth, but another time we were driving to the hospital. And we were talking, and I completely missed a turn to go not into the hospital, one of the roads to take us there. And she was like, David, you've missed the last 3 turns. And I noticed there was this part of me that was like, oh shit, I've messed up. I fucked up. And it wanted to be like defend myself in some way, or like even be like accuse her of like, oh, you should have told me before. You should have warned me before the first turn. Now, an old version of me would have said those things or done one of those things, and that, suddenly I'm pushing the blame onto her, or I'm defending myself in some way, right? Which can easily create a disconnection and conflict in that moment. But me now is like, oh yeah, I missed the turn. And I said, oh, I feel a bit embarrassed. How have I missed a turn? She was like, we were just talking. I was like, okay. She was like, you can take the next one. I was like, okay, cool. And she said, oh, do you want me to tell you when each of the turns are coming? And I was like, no, that's okay. I'll pay more attention now. And you see there, because I can notice what I'm feeling and the reaction come up, instead of being overcome by it, I can choose to take a different choice than reacting to that emotion and feeling. And this sounds so simple, right? But this is the crux of your life. Like, if you could master this, and I have not mastered this, there's areas of my life that I have not mastered this, where I can observe the reaction and not follow its path of reacting, right? It's life-changing. It really is, because it means you stop habitually reacting in ways that are nothing to do with the moment, and all to do with your internalized story of fear and negativity about yourself and the meaning these things have and how that affects your life. So that's something I've done around commitment, and a lot of other areas of just like any fears that would come up and judgments, internal stories. The next thing I started to really change was around intuition. I did a lot of work with a man called William Whitecloud, who's on the podcast actually a long time ago. I can't tell you what episode it is. It's about overthinking. If you type in overthinking and the Authentic Man podcast, you'll find it. William Whitecloud and me, one of the older episodes of me and AJ. Did a lot of intuition work with him, and that was so powerful, because one of the things that I think avoidant men really struggle with is they don't trust themselves in their decisions. So they're always overthinking things, and trying to be like, oh, should I do this or should I do that? And what the intuition work with him, and I take my clients through the same work as well, did for me was I had a way to just like feel into what was right for me, and I got an answer, then I could move on. I wasn't spending lots of time overthinking what I should do, and oh my gosh, should I do this? Should I do this? I could just instantly go in, feel into my own intuition, ask a question, ask for an answer, get an answer, and then move forward. And that was life-changing to me in the day-to-day things, in my relationship, all sorts of things, right? It made such a difference, as well as the other work out of William's work around. There's various practices that I've taken into my life that I use very regularly. It's a conflict process that I use very regularly with myself, my clients, like just to see what was underneath our reactions or underneath the thoughts, because this is just so much of what's going on in your relationships in your life. It's not, oh, the women you'll meet are like this. It's your reaction to them that's creating the problem. Because if you react differently to them, you react differently in your relationships, you have a different relationship. If you're reacting from shame and fear, then you will create more shame and fear. That's the simple thing in relationships. And most people are continually reacting from shame and fear and insecurity in their relationships. And if we learn to not do so, we have a different experience of relationships and different experience of people. Another thing I'd like to change is my gauge on how a man should be, or what a man should be like. And this is an important piece because this is kind of masculinity, and masculinity intertwines with my journey hugely. Is I started to see that as a man, my whole thing wasn't about making money and having lots of sex. I grew up on 90s hip hop, 90s and 2000 hip hop, and it was basically money and sex. Has it changed very much? A little bit. You got some better artists out there, the Commons, the Talib Kweli's, the Mos Defs, the Kendrick Lamar's. There's a bit more out there, but I was really I had no male role models to show me how to be a man, and the things that were missing in my life as a young boy was money, and what I noticed I got respect from other men was sex. And when I started to shift that as to being more about something deeper, honesty, integrity, feedback, support. Like as a man, I looked at my character in many ways and was like, I'm doing these things and I don't think these things are good for me or other people. And because I became more compassionate and empathetic, I'd be like, oh my God, if someone did that to me, I would feel this way. And I started to change my actions. So I started to shift, I think when you become more empathetic and compassionate, it's impossible to keep taking actions that actually hurt people, because you basically feel it. And I think this is one of the reasons why many men don't become more compassionate and empathetic, is because they don't want to feel the pain of the things they've done in their lives, or the things they do in their lives now to people that cause pain. And if we don't become compassionate, empathetic and feeling, then we never have to kind of go there unless people tell us. And even then we can become defensive and tell them they're wrong and we're right, and we can move on. I think it's a big thing for a lot of men. Fear. I really spent a lot of time with fear and noticing fear. As I've mentioned a lot of times, I think that this is the most important work we can do to shift our relationships and shift how we relate, especially as avoidant men, is because for a lot of avoidant men, and I say this again, for most avoidant men, fear is what governs their relationships and governs their dating lives, or the avoidance of fear, shall I say, because they're taking actions. It's like, how can I meet this woman and create a relationship without having to touch my fear of intimacy, or my fear of closeness, or my fear of losing my independence? There's like this constant avoidance of meeting the fear. So part of a lot of, what the work that I did to change is meeting my fear with support as well. Don't forget that one. It's really important when you do stuff like this, you have support. I had multiple coaches over the last, 5-6 years. I probably had, multiple coaches, coaching programs, men's group programs, men's circles, and so forth. Because often you need people around you to ask you the right questions for you to see the fear, because often you think the fear is real, or you think the story is real. So having another person ask you questions about your thought patterns enables you to see more of what's going on underneath. I'd be impossible to be where I am without the support I've had. And all the people I know who are the most successful people I know, who I look up to, all of them that I know personally, they've all had multiple coaches and still do. So having that support made such a difference in being able to see those fears. How did I change? So how did I go from this person who was, afraid of commitment to having a baby? Because, it's a big one. I've said a lot of it, meditation, workshops, retreats. Men's work's been a really big part of my journey. Some of the retreats I've been on around that. Practicing sharing emotions, feeling frustrations, feeling resentments, embodiment work, the intuition stuff, Judgments, that's a special piece here. It's like letting go of this need to be judgmental of people all the time. And a lot of this comes from the inner critic. And this is a quite central piece of the work I do often with people, is around the inner critic, because our inner critic, especially for avoidant men, plays absolute havoc on us because it's so negative. It's so harsh, right? It's so belittling of ourselves and other people. So you have to do something about it, because your inner critic is how you talk to yourself, right? And if you talk to yourself like you're a piece of shit, you're going to treat yourself like a piece of shit. Or you're going to definitely talk to yourself like a piece of shit in the times when it's difficult and when you really need compassion and you need empathy and you need support. Thus is so important, so important to shift how our inner critic is. And also, one of the other things I think big things help me change is actually looking at my childhood. I spend a lot of time looking at my childhood and forgiving my parents for things that they did and didn't do, accepting that certain things happened and seeing the silver lining on some of them. How some things shaped me into being a very independent man. And the independence served me really well. And now I'm moving and more into a state of interdependence. A relationship is an interdependent unit where I'm dependent on her, she's dependent on me, and our little boy now is completely dependent on us. It's interesting that when we get stuck in independence, which I think is a very adolescent thing to do, I don't need anybody, it's kind of independence. We think that's the highest level of achievement. Like, I don't need anybody, I'm self-sufficient. When actually the higher level is interdependence. I'm recording this after I watched the tennis Wimbledon final. The winner was Alcaraz. I think Djokovic was the runner-up. And you would see a tennis player and think, yeah, man, look at that guy on his own, doing his own thing, that lone ranger. But it's not. He has a whole team, 20 odd people supporting him in doing what he does on that court. And he's dependent on them and they're dependent on him to some degree, right? And that's what makes them great champions. I like to use sports as an example because it's easy in individual sports for it to look like they're a lone ranger doing everything together. So one of the things that helped me change was support, getting support, connecting with people and asking for support made a big difference to my life. Another big way I changed actually here was my metric for success. I used to see success only as money and how much money people were making as success. And I don't see that as that way actually at all anymore. I've met some very wealthy people in my life. Like I've met, like multi-millionaires, people who are aiming to get into the kind of hundreds, even to kind of become billionaires. And I've met some of these people and they're miserable because all they think about is money. And to them, the only thing that's important is money, which means that they have allowed a lot of relationships in their lives to kind of fall by the wayside and become very lonely. I've got clients who are millionaires and they're incredibly lonely. Some of the work we do together is help them make more friends and create great relationships. So I started to shift my metric for success, to love and connection and experiences. I look at my time traveling and it's like, I felt like such a wealthy man when I came back from my travels. I had no money, but I felt wealthy in life and experience. Like I'd just been around the world and back. Like, wow, what an experience. I probably didn't earn upwards of maybe £200,000 because I was away. But what I got back in return, those life experiences were way outweighed that. So switching my metric for success allowed me to put more focus on love and connection and depth and understanding and empathy and compassion, which then in turn helped me grow my relationships in those ways because those things become more and more important to me. And I guess one of the other things that really kind of helped me is also values. I started to shift my values. Like, what do I value? What's important to me? Is honesty important to me? Well, yeah, actually, because when I'm honest with people, I feel like a better person. I feel better. When I'm kind to people, I feel good. It feels nice to be kind to people. Does it feel nice to be unkind to myself? No, it doesn't feel nice to be unkind to myself, so I can be kind to myself. Does it feel good to be lazy? No, it doesn't, so I want to push myself, but there's a balance to be found. So it's like shifting values as well. That's a big one. What else changed? I think connecting to the mystical and the unexplained. Some of this for me came through like some psychedelic experiences. Some of this came through just observing life as it is, seeing some really mystical experiences, whether that's healing sessions and Reiki and all sorts of things like that. And instead of just dismissing them as stupid or nonsensical or looking for logic, it's just accepting them as they are. Because, there's so much in our universe that man can't explain. And accepting that, not always looking for a reason or looking for causality, like this equals that. Like the world is not this tidy little sum. There's a lot of messy sums that are there as well. Were there any difficult moments? There was. I fell in love with a woman. I often tell this story. I fell in love with a woman who didn't love me back. That was a really difficult moment, but that was one of I tell you, I look back and it was hard. And I read something on my phone recently, actually, it was me talking about how I was feeling during that time. And I was feeling awful. I really was. And this is a lesson to anyone in a breakup as well. I was feeling really awful, but actually, man, without that, it set me free in so many ways, because I realized that someone breaking my heart, I could recover and I could be fine. So a lot of you are running around in your life, dating life, relationship, and the one thing you're trying to avoid is ever being hurt. And if you're avoiding being hurt, you're avoiding really giving yourself to anything. You're avoiding really leaning into something that could actually make it great. You're keeping it superficial to some level because you're avoiding the heartbreak. And once I realized I could lean in, have my heart broken, and recover, I was like, wow, I'm free. I can really love. I can really love again. I can love. So leaning in that way. What else was difficult? Oh man, I remember there were times at the beginning of me and Orsa's relationship where we would have difficult conversations and she would cry a lot and she'd be upset. And I'd always taken tears to kind of mean that I've done something wrong, I'm bad. And I had to really readjust my system, my nervous system, my mind, my brain, of seeing her crying as just her expressing some emotion. And that was it. Her expressing some emotion, it didn't mean that was bad and wrong anyway. And that was another pivotal shift for me as well. Difficult moments trying to decide when to have a baby. That was and I'll probably talk about more in another episode. But that was really difficult for me because there's a lot of my fears and insecurities kind of came up now around that. A lot of fears and insecurities came around that. So, like, do I have enough money? Do we have enough? I want some more time? I just need a bit longer. All that stuff kind of came up. Is this the right person? Is it the right, all that kind of came up, and me seeing that it was just more fear that's not based in the future or the future that I get to create. This is the thing, more than anything, I hope you take from this episode is your fears tell you that you're powerless to create your future. And in fact, if you believe in your own power to create the future you want, your fears become unimportant because you get to create the future. So you can just create it. Instead of being afraid that your fears will come true, you can just aim for and put energy into what you really desire, what you really want. So where am I now? I got a baby. He's 4 weeks old at this moment when I record this. I'm in a really happy monogamous relationship with Orsa. I have been for 4 or 5 years. My business is thriving and growing more and more. I quit my tech job, a few years ago to start this work with men. I'm seeing men really transform their lives, Every so often I get a message from an old client. He's just like, hey, I'm in a new relationship, or hey, I'm out of that relationship that was really toxic, or I found a new job, or, life is really good. I've got, that's probably the most beautiful thing to hear. Or I hear from people who listen to the podcast like you, and they're like, they told me that, what they've been hearing has really helped them in their relationship or in their career or whatever it is. And it's really beautiful to hear that. I also feel really kind of in touch with how I feel in my life. And I have a lot of compassion for the world and people. I have wonderful friendships. I've got a better relationship with my parents than I have in many years, and my family. There's a lot of good things that are in my life. There's also things I don't like. There's also things I want to change and transform. But you see, this has been my journey, right? And this is now the work that I do with men. And I've got 2 things I'm going to direct you to, and they're both going to be in the show notes. They're both links you can click on. One of them is a free workshop that I have. It's happening on the 13th of August, right? It's a free workshop on the 13th of August. It's called Overcoming Avoidance for Men. And I'm going to take you through kind of 4 proven techniques. Going in more depth, I'm going to explain more than I did in this podcast. And that's something that's free. You can come along. There's links in the show notes. Come along. Especially if you haven't met me before, come along. It'll be a wonderful workshop. And I was just going through the 4 things that I think, the 4 main techniques, the 4 proven tools that be really useful to men to overcome their avoidance, right? And then the second thing is, if you want to take things really much, much deeper than that, you want to really tackle your avoidance in the company of other men who want to, right? Because you may not have friends who are like-minded, who want to shift and change. So I bring men together, great men who are interesting and fascinating and committed to being better men, because that sort of circle of men, being with that sort of level of men is far more transformative than doing it on your own. And I say this as someone that's been involved in men's work and support networks and groups and so forth to help me get to where I am. And I've seen it in the group programs I've run, which have changed people's lives. So if that's something you're interested, I've got a wait list. There's also in the show notes. You can add yourself to that, and I will let you know when I finalize the details for that program, which are going to be very soon, actually. And then you can jump on, once it's not going to be, if you're on that wait list, you also get huge discounts of the full price. So I really recommend you do that as well. So this is the end of the episode. I've gone on for 40 minutes, quite surprised, but I hope you've taken something from this. If you know someone who is really avoidant of commitment, fear of intimacy and so forth, send him this episode, because it's really easy when you feel like this to feel alone and to feel like no one's like you or no one understands you. So please feel free to send this over to them as well, so to help them with their lives, and they may come to my workshop and might change their lives as well. And if you've loved this episode, please just give it a little star rating on Spotify or write a little review. Super useful. It helps me get the podcast out to more and more people, and more men can be helped and assisted in what they're dealing with and the struggles that they're dealing with as well. And until next week, say ciao, ciao. I want to say a big thank you for listening. It's people like yourself that really help get the podcast out into the world. Especially if you're often sharing the episodes and the podcast with people that you feel just could do with listening, right? Can see a different way of being a man, maybe a different way of having dating lives and intimacy and relationships. So I want to say a big thank you. And if maybe after listening to this episode, you think, oh, there's someone actually who could really do with this, please share it with them, share the love. I'm really, really grateful. And if, you want to get in contact with me for any questions, or you want to talk about coaching or any working together, feel free to reach out to me on Instagram @theauthenticman_, or you can email me hello@theauthenticman.net. Thank you very much.